No, Melissa, it was only a few months ago that she did a COC, and due to a series of events, the mid-Candidature review has sort of come up very close to the COC, and she's the very first person from IPI to do a mid-Candidature review. So take it away, Melissa.
Thank you, Anthony. So, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Melissa Schellekens, and thank you for joining me for my mid-Candidature review. I am very excited to be presenting it. So, the topic of my thesis is social vulnerability and self-concept. More specifically, I'm looking at identifying moderators of the relation between academic self-concept and high school completion. This is a photo that I purchased from Shutterstock. So I was reading the news a couple of months ago, and I was quite shocked to read about the coronial inquest into 13 young Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander people that had suicided in the Kimberley region of Northern Australia. What was particularly shocking was the fact that 2 of those 13 kids were only 10 years old. That is a national disgrace, and we are letting down our First Nations people. And what that really did when I read it was it really reinforced to me the importance of this type of work that we're doing here at IPPE. And it was interesting because what I read about was actually the connection between Indigenous youth suicide and school attendance rates. Virtually all of those 13 Indigenous young people had very low rates of school attendance. So in the case of Indigenous young people, their lives may actually depend on attending school, on having good engagement with school and completing school. So I just want to clarify up front, when I'm talking about vulnerable young people, I'm talking about young people that are at risk of not realising their potential to achieve positive life outcomes, and where that risk is shaped by underlying social dimensions based on social and economic conditions that these young kids are finding themselves in. And being vulnerable is not a quality of individuals. It is instead an outcome of what happens to young people through their education and through their life journeys. So this is a 20-minute presentation, but I'm just going to give you the take-home messages up front for those who like it short and sweet. The first take-home message is what I am studying is how academic self-concept predicts high school completion for socially vulnerable groups. I'm looking at what factors determine the degree to which academic self-concept predicts high school completion, and I'm interested in how this works for Indigenous young people. And why am I studying this? Because completing high school is important, particularly for Indigenous students. And if the influence of self-concept on school completion differs for different groups of students, one-size-fits-all policies and interventions that neglect student context may not be the best way to keep kids at school. The third take-home message is how am I addressing this and what is my progress? So I'm addressing this through 2 studies, a systematic review and some regression modelling. For my systematic review, I'm synthesising the research on the relation between academic self-concept and high school educational outcomes related to high school completion, to identify moderators and to see what the gaps are. And I am also, with that one, I'm at the phase of the title and abstract screening, which I'm almost finished. With the second study, I am testing identified moderators from study 1 between academics, looking at how they might moderate the relation between academic self-concept and high school completion, and also exploring potential gaps. And I'm seeing how this applies to Indigenous students using 2 cohorts of a large longitudinal and representative Australian data set. In terms of that, I've done some initial work getting established with R. I have imported the data sets and explored the data sets. I've selected some initial variables, and I'm looking at how the weighting applies and understanding how the LSA data sets work. They're quite complicated. So, to begin, high school completion is pretty important. High school completers live longer lives than those that don't complete high school. They make a bigger contribution to society through taxes, they're less unemployed, they earn more money over their lifetime, they're healthier and they're happier than those that drop out of high school. High school dropouts die younger than those that complete high school. They have increased depression, they are more frequently unemployed, they spend more time in jail, they're unhealthier, make less social contribution and earn less income over their lifetime. And high school dropout is a problem in Australia, as it is in virtually all countries. 12% of young Australians don't complete high school. 40% of those from the lowest socioeconomic backgrounds don't complete high school. 35% of young Indigenous Australians don't complete, but in remote and very remote areas of Australia, this rate of dropout increases to 57%, and in some specific areas it's as high as 70%. So what is my slice of this problem? I am really looking to understand, it's pretty important that we can understand the complex interplay of factors that predict whether a young person will complete high school or not. And we really need to understand how a particular factor, in this case self-concept, matters in its broader context, that is the social and economic environment that a student may find themselves. So we can take action where it matters most, so vulnerable young people have the best chance to complete high school and lead long, meaningful and productive lives. So just a quick recap on what my studies are. Study 1, the objectives of that systematic review is to synthesise the research on the relation between academic self-concept and high school educational outcomes in the recent literature, and to identify the moderators of the relation between self-concept and high school educational outcomes and identify gaps. The specific research questions of this study are: what is the relation between academic self-concept and high school educational outcomes, including high school completion, school attendance, and school engagement? And what social and economic factors moderate the relation between academic self-concept and high school educational outcomes? And particularly, does the relation between academic self-concept and high school educational outcomes vary with Indigenous students? So, how is progress on that going? I'm sure you're all wondering. So, as Anthony mentioned, I did my confirmation of candidature at the end of November. And since then, I have finalised my systematic review protocol with the inclusion and exclusion criteria. That's been registered with Prospero using the Cochrane methodology. I have searched these databases, this is up here, using the search terms that I derived from target articles that I could find through Google, and then really looked at key terms and found some other target articles and derived search terms that way. So I searched the databases using those search terms, brought all the findings together into EndNote, removed duplicate documents, put them into Covidence, and since then, probably about 3 weeks ago, I started the abstract and title screening with the invaluable help of Ashkar and Marcus, who have been absolutely exceptional in the speed which they've gone through that. Marcus is just did a really amazing effort. In fact, those guys have finished their part before me, so I'm super appreciative. And so with this one, I've got these following steps to continue working on. There's a number of considerations that have come up with this one. There was a recommendation from the panel for my confirmation of candidature that, or perhaps a concern that I needed to, that I would not have enough studies looking at the relation between self-concept and high school dropout. So I've actually expanded that to look at high school dropout related variables. So I've included student engagement as being the major predictor for school completion or school dropout, and other related variables. And as a result, next slide, you can see this is just a snapshot of my competence screening from a couple of days ago. I've actually now done a bit more than that, but and as you can see, there's 47 studies that we have agreement on. That's good. There's 150 that we still need to resolve, and I need to keep working through that. So hopefully we'll get enough studies. It's looking okay at this point. So yeah, there's been a few things, a few considerations with that, but that's moving forward, so that's good. And in terms of, so yeah, there's a few, just from the initial literature review and from some of those studies that have been emerging, there's a variety of potential moderators that enable or constrain a young person's decision to complete school. These are some of them there. Socioeconomic status is one that has come up as a strong one, which was as we anticipated. And we're quite interested in seeing how this might work in the case of Indigenous young people. So for study 2, that's a multilinear regression modelling, the objectives of that study are to determine the extent that Indigenous status may moderate the relation between academic self-concept and high school completion, and determine the extent to which SES may moderate the relation between academic self-concept and high school completion. And the research questions relating to that are, will the benefit of academic self-concept and high school completion vary with Indigenous status? And will the benefit of academic self-concept and high school completion vary for students with a socioeconomic background? And in terms of doing that analysis, it's structured around a moderated mediation framework in which we have academic achievement as the independent variable and high school completion as the outcome variable. And we have academic self-concept as the mediator of that relation between the two. And what we're really interested in finding is what influences the strength of this link. And so we're particularly focusing at this point around, if we put socioeconomic status here, how does that look? And then if we put Indigenous status there as well, we can see whether there's interaction. And of course, it'll be interesting to see the final findings of study 1 and see actually what are the moderators that have been identified, and potentially looking at how they may interact as well. And so we're using the moderation, so for this part of it, we're looking at the moderation effect between that relation using the barrier-tuning approach that has subsequently been built on by these models. And my progress with this one, very fortunately, I'm working, well, this type of modelling and working with art in the past has not been my forte, so I am very grateful to be working with experienced researchers, including Professor Joseph Cherokee and Professor Phil Parker and Dr. Baljinder Sadra in these studies. That's really appreciative of that opportunity. So I have familiarised myself with the data sets, and so I will be using LSA 2003 and the LSA 2009 cohorts. of the longitudinal surveys of Australian youth. I've spent quite a bit of time exploring and selecting potential variables, and anyone that knows LSA will know that there is almost an infinite number of variables, and it's super complex trying to find similar variables between the cohorts because it swaps around and changes. So I've spent a bit of time getting acquainted with those two cohorts. In terms of the variables that I'm using at this point are Indigenous status, which is quite a simple one. Just does the person identify as being Indigenous or not? Also socioeconomic status. So the socioeconomic status in LSA 2003-2009 is measured by the Economic, Cultural and Social Index of PISA, and that's basically an index which uses the highest level of parental education along with the highest status of the parental occupation of a student, along with a measure of possessions in the home, which has 3 subcategories looking at wealth possessions, cultural possessions, and also educational related possessions in the home, such as access to computers, internet, having your own room, books to help you at school. Some of the other things that they have under the wealth is things like, you know, how many telephones, how many cars do you have in your house, how many bathrooms, and then with the cultural component of that, they look at things like, do you have poetry, works of art in the house, and literature and that kind of stuff. And also there's another one which is the number of books in the household. So that one is quite a nice one, and it's a development from some of the earlier cohorts in the longitudinal surveys of Australian youth, where they used less sophisticated measures of socioeconomic status. And while this measure has been generally agreed to be sufficiently validated, there are some concerns with it. Evidence has shown actually that because we're asking students about their parents' level of education and also their parents' occupational status, there's quite a bit of a variation in terms of how well students are able to answer that correctly. And it varies across countries. So some countries, the correlations between the parents' response to those questions and the students' response to those questions are really good. And in other countries, they're actually almost completely uncorrelated. So it's quite an interesting concept about how well does a student understand their own parents' occupational status and level of education. And another one with that is because it's actually that index was developed to measure inter-country, has been standardised to compare across countries in PISA. There's been some authors who have said actually that measure is less reliable when you're just using it within the Australian context, you're not comparing across countries. So there's a few issues around that sort of stuff with some of the variables. I'm also looking at the high school non-completion variable, of which there is a whole stack of different ones and they all can be applied in different ways. Basically I'm using the variable which is, did the kid leave school before completing year 12? And I ask that question every year, and I'm still understanding exactly how that one works. And so yeah, so this is basically where I'm up to. I'm filtering the data, cleaning the data, removing missing data, understanding. LSA is a very complicated data set, it's really enormous, and the way that they do their sampling is at the individual level and at the school level. And then of course there has to be a lot of sampling weights applied to keep the sample representative of the broader population. So they apply sampling weights and then also attrition weights, basically to account for the fact that every year, because it runs for 10 years, some of the students drop out and we need to keep it representative. So that's quite a complicated arrangement with the weighting. And and I also have recently just read that the way that they do that in 2003 compared to 2009 is different, in that 2009 they use logistic regressions for the attrition weights, but not for 2003, so I'm not sure how that plays out either. So yes, there's quite a bit more that needs to go ahead with that. Also, we're waiting to see the findings of study 1 to better inform this study. And also it will be interesting because there were significant policy changes in the age that kids are allowed to leave school, and that changed from between 2003 and 2009, so that will be interesting to see how that impacts on the findings, and obviously that's something I need to get my head around once we've run the models and have analysed the data a bit more. So that's really where I'm at with study 2. Another consideration actually is with the self-concept variable. This is the way that we're measuring it. Currently, looking at general academic self-concept, so this question here, these are other questions that are available that are subject related, so English, maths and science, looking at the student's self-concept in each of those subjects. And these questions occur in the 2003 and 2009 cohort. There are some other questions that are available in the 2003 cohort that might be more useful in terms of strengthening the self-concept variable, including maths self-concept and maths self-efficacy, but the problem is that they don't exist in the 2009 cohort. So consideration is whether this variable is strong enough, and so I'm looking into that as well. This is just about the SES measure. And so this is just a quick timeline. This is where I'm at today. Candidature review, May, yes. I've got those steps to go, but my completion is in September, October 2020. So that's basically where I'm at in terms of progress. So, just to recap, what am I studying? I'm looking at how academic self-concept predicts high school completion for socially vulnerable groups. I'm looking at what factors determine the degree to which academic self-concept predicts high school completion and how this might work for Indigenous students. Why? Because completing high school is really important. In fact, young people's lives may depend on it. And if the influence of self-concept on school completion differs for different student groups, then one-size-fits-all policies and interventions may not be the best way to keep kids in school. How's my progress going on the systematic review? I'm basically almost finished the title and abstract screening, and that should happen, I think, really by mid-next week, if not sooner. And with the modelling, I'm still working through that. I'm going to keep thinking about some of those considerations, finalise the variables, learn more about how the weighting should be applied, wait for the findings of study 1, and then keep going, run the models and analyse the data. So I'd just like to say thank you primarily to Dr. Anthony Dillon, who's just been exceptional. Thank you so much for your support, and also to Professor Janet Mooney. I do deeply appreciate your help. And thank you also to Phil, Joe, and Dr. And thanks to you guys for coming. Thank you.
We had a burning question here.
Yeah, I know that parent sentiment payment is now attached to whether or not their child attends school at a certain rate, and school reports back to Centrelink, like if a child doesn't come to school for a certain amount of time. I don't know when that came into effect, and I just wanted to put it. That's going to be interesting. Something.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder when it did come into effect.
Yeah.
It's something that hasn't been received a lot of criticism. Schools often don't report, and so you have the problem where I've heard in some schools kids are getting certificates for attendance when they haven't been attending, and there's a whole host of problems. But the general consensus is, again, it's extrinsic motivation that punishment and stick effect doesn't work.
Does that work?
Sorry?
That doesn't work?
Works in your household?
Two complications. One is that in the PISA study, you've got all 15-year-olds. The base, I'll say in the PISA is based on you've got all 15-year-olds, but they can be in quite different year groups. And so you need to look at, so a 15-year-old can be in one of 3 or 4 different year groups.
Yeah.
And that obviously makes a difference in terms of completion,
Yes.
and in a complicated sort of way.
Yes.
Guess the other one is the issue of school average ability. I mean, we talked about this a little bit before. One of the early Big Fish, Little Pond effect studies that I did was looking at the relationship between Black American self-concept and white American self-concept. And the argument there was that the black self-concepts were inflated because they were too high relative to what their achievements were. And I was able to show that if you went back and looked at the schools where they came from, that they were high, they were quite reasonable in relation to the schools that they came from, because the achievement in the black segregated schools were low. And then Phil's done some really interesting work looking at how your self-concept is advantaged by going to a school where the school average ability is low, but that doesn't always translate, or oftentimes doesn't translate into outcomes.
Yes.
So it gets,
Yes.
so there's some interesting complications to play around with. They may not be the focus of your study, but they probably need to be considered.
Yes, absolutely. Particularly looking at some of the more remote Indigenous schools where there are, a lot of majority Indigenous students that might elevate their self-concept, and then how that relates to the outcome. Yeah, cool. Thank you.
You were looking at moderators between self-concept and high school completion or other high school outcome. That's fine, but wouldn't you also want to look at moderators of the relationship of achievement to completion, and the moderators of the relationship between achievement and self-concept?
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, I have actually not been focusing on academic achievement specifically in this one. I've really tried to be looking at more behavioural school outcomes. Attendance and engagement and dropout. But yeah, that would be interesting to see, and all the data is there. So to do that. I was also thinking to actually look at, and this was a recommendation from the COC panel, and I actually forgot to mention it in my presentation, when I'm looking at the relation between academic self-concept and these educational outcomes, also looking at potential mediators of that relation, not just moderators. And so while I haven't actually included that as a research question or an objective of the research, I will be extracting information relating to whether this moderation affects whether the variables show moderation as well as, mediation as well as moderation. I'm just not sure that's one of the considerations, how that might work in terms of actually thinking about it and how that complicates things with the diagram.
Well, when you look at moderation, you almost have to look at mediation as part of the same model.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't really look at interaction effect without looking at main effects.
Yes.
It sort of pushes you into a mediation situation whether you want to or not.
Yeah. Yes, well, yeah, so this is the moderated mediation model. It would be quite a different model if I was looking at other mediation effects between the self-concept and school completion. So, yes.
Along similar lines, I was interested, you have a lot of moderated variables that are around sort of external forces, socioeconomic status, things like this. I think a lot of the Indigenous models of wellbeing suggest some kind of a mediation model with some of those forces impacting wellbeing and then that impacting outcomes. So I'm just wondering, did you consider thinking about wellbeing in some of these models?
Not really, to be honest. I was really just orienting around some of the more demographic type external influences. And I suppose the driver of that was really around looking at quite a lot of, a number of researchers have been indicating that there's a real gap in the data, particularly, for example, Freeman and Simonson in 2015 did a systematic review looking at a variety of interventions to prevent high school dropout, and they really commented that there was a real gap in the research around addressing factors like socioeconomic status and other kind of vulnerability or disadvantage factors that might influence it. So I suppose that really was my emphasis in this instance. But yeah, I will actually check some of that out.
Yeah, that sort of might provide an interesting contrast to think about those external forces, how they might impact the person in relation to the outcome.
Yes, absolutely.
You mentioned engagement. How is engagement measured?
Do you mean in the first study?
You mentioned it before that you were broadening the outcomes, I think, so it's not just attendance.
Yeah. So
That's
actually,
a hard one to measure.
yeah, in the first study, there's some different ways of measuring, and so I haven't actually looked into the specific studies at this point because I'm only at the title and abstract screening phase. But there is some I know that there's some quite strong student engagement questionnaires that have been developed. And the reason that I did include that was because student engagement is the strongest predictor of high school dropout or lack of student engagement. But yeah, so there are some tools that do measure that, I believe, quite well, but I'm not exactly sure which ones have been included so far in this study.
Well, this is academic engagement, I assume.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely.
So that narrows it relative to
Yes.
a lot of measures of engagement.
Yes, it is. It is. I'm very much looking at academic student engagement around competencies and abilities relating to student academics.
You got another question?
I was just going to ask, is your study going to be focused mainly on Indigenous population, or is it across the board?
Sorry?
Is your study focused on Indigenous population, or is it across the board?
Well, we're quite interested to see how the interplay of factors works in the Indigenous context, but it is more broad than that. So we're looking at socioeconomic status and looking to see out of the first study what are some of the other variables that might come out and how that might.
For my own purpose, yes. Does alcohol actually contribute to socioeconomic status in any way? Like the parents' alcohol consumption, is that?
Not in the way that it's measured. In the second study,
Yeah.
it's not measured. It's not included in the way that they measure it in a longitudinal survey of Australian youth.
Because I'm just thinking that for the more remote areas, alcohol becomes a bigger factor and determinant of social economic just status within themselves. Because when you don't have an employer, you get your money from one source, and you spend all that money on alcohol. You don't have money for anything else. And everybody is standardised living, but that could be a massive contributing factor to the home life.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I guess there's a variety of clustered factors, particularly around the Indigenous.
In some remote areas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some of them dry.
Yeah, that's what years ago, I keep bringing this up. I did a random going up to the Northern Territory for a week thing to all these different communities and schools. And what I noticed was the dry communities always had a higher engagement level with the students, and the ones that weren't dry, the attendance and just general engagement of the students was a lot lower, and also the community engagement with the school itself.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. Yes.
Lisa, I feel that there are possibly three challenges in the analysis. Like the first one is you don't have a lot of variables, outcome variables to choose from the data set. Second, you don't have a lot of moderators or mediators to choose from. Right? You only have indigenous and socio-economic status, I guess. And the third challenge is, between the two studies, if in the first study you find something that is interesting, for example, a moderator that is interesting, but that variable is not available in your data set, so what happens?
Well, that is a very good question. Yeah, that's a very good question.
Well, I guess that moderator is still an important, interesting finding in itself for that particular study.
Yeah.
Celebrate that. But
Yeah.
Where do you go?
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. But then the next chapter is about you're looking at that moderator, but the moderator is not testable. Because in the data set you don't have that moderator.
So, yeah. Well, I guess in one sense we need to start off with a list.
Yeah. Say if the moderator is location, like geographical location, in a rural place, well, you're a different person, but you don't have that in the data set, so what are you going to do?
Fortunately, we do have location in the LSA data sets. But yeah, some of the other ones, that is an issue, absolutely. That's requires some consideration how that can be addressed.
I mean, that's always the challenge in archival data research, is that you can only use the variables that are there, and sometimes you have to adjust your research question to fit what's there, and sometimes you have to mash variables together to get a close approximation of what you want. I mean, it's just part and parcel of, I mean, the contrast to that is that if you were collecting the data yourself, there's no way that you can get access to 2 cohorts of longitudinal data from 20,000 kids each.
One of the questions.
There's an opportunity.
I'm sorry, I couldn't see you behind me.
Is this an opportunity if the Indigenous component becomes very interesting with results from study 1 or study and or study 2, to look at other databases such as LSIC, which have a wider variety of moderator variables that might be more Indigenous specific as well? Have you guys thought of that?
I think it's quite a bit younger, isn't it, that the LSIC data, I think they're quite young, they're up to the age of 10, is that right?
I'm not really sure yet.
Yeah, we'd have to look into it to see whether, I think they're quite big.
Kids.
Yeah,
I don't think they're high school
I think
kids.
they're about 16 now.
Oh, okay.
Herb, you'll have to be the last question.
Okay. Your focus is on one size that fits all. The fact that something moderates a relationship doesn't mean that it doesn't work for that group. It may mean that it works better or worse. Do you have any way, is that just sort of a generic overlay, or are you actually going to try and come up with some ways as to interventions that would be uniquely appropriate for Indigenous or remote or low SES?
Yeah, that would be a fantastic body of work. I actually think if we could have, I mean, this might be a postdoc or some other subsequent study.
I'm not saying actually carry out the intervention, but I'm wondering whether you're actually going to seriously test that notion about one size fits all, or whether that's just sort of a generic.
Yeah, I guess at this point, the way I have been thinking about it, it is more of a concept that if actually we know that one approach works better for a group of students than others, we might be more selective about how we try and be as effective and efficient as we can when working with a particular group. But that would be, I mean, I think the more applied research ends up being, the better, is my own personal.
So for example, if you had a self-concept enhancement, presumably that you would argue that that would raise self-concept, and if you have a moderation between Indigenous status and the link between self-concept and high school completion, would that make you argue that one size doesn't fit all, or does it, or does maybe not?
Well, yeah, I really would have to just, you know, when we do run the analysis, really get into the findings and understand really what they mean. So, yeah, I couldn't answer that question at this point in time.
Okay, due to time constraints, we have to wrap up there. So thank you very much, Melissa.
Thank you.
Thank you.